A granite mountain, a crowd of thousands gathered for the country's 250th birthday, and buried inside a patriotic speech, 3 sentences that may have just rewritten the rules of an entire ongoing conflict in real time. If you think what was said at Mount Rushmore on July 4th was just a throwaway applause line at a rally, you've misread how this moment actually works, how this war has been fought, and what those specific words communicated to every audience receiving them at once. In Washington, in Tehran, in Doha, in Beijing, in Jerusalem, and in every room right now where someone is trying to figure out what happens next. Today is July 5th, 2026, the day after America's 250th birthday. And while hundreds of thousands of Iranian mourners fill the streets of Tehran for the second day of a 6-day state funeral, chanting for vengeance under red banners that symbolize the promise of retaliatory blood, the American president's words from the night before are being clipped, translated, broadcast, and weaponized across every faction of Iranian politics simultaneously. Not as propaganda, as evidence. And depending on which faction is using it, the exact same 3 sentences are being used to prove 2 completely opposite things at the same time. That is the specific kind of strategic communication that gets missed if you're only watching the surface. So let's not miss it. Understand first why this moment carries more weight than an ordinary rally soundbite normally would. This isn't a president commenting on a settled historical episode from a comfortable distance. This is a sitting head of state making real-time public statements about an active adversary, during an active diplomatic pause, about an active funeral for a leader his own military killed, while indirect negotiations over that same country's nuclear program remain genuinely unresolved. Every word choice in a moment like that gets parsed by professional analysts in multiple capitals within hours, not because the words were accidental, but because everyone involved knows they weren't. Start with exactly what was said, because precision matters here. Standing beneath the carved granite faces of Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln on the eve of the country's 250th birthday, the American president said this: "We knocked the hell out of Iran. They're dying to settle. They want to settle so badly. We gave them a week off for a funeral because we're nice. That was it." A brief handful of sentences inside a 28-minute address focused mostly on American history, ideology, and the midterm elections coming in November. And yet, those few sentences are now among the most analyzed pieces of communication to come out of this entire conflict, because each phrase inside them was doing specific strategic work across multiple audiences that are not all hearing the same message. Let's build this out completely, because the gap between the official story and what's actually happening in rooms nobody outside them can see is where the real picture lives. First, the backdrop. Because in strategic communication, the setting is never decoration. It is content. Mount Rushmore, on the eve of America's 250th birthday, is not a neutral venue for a foreign policy statement about Iran. It is one of the most symbolically charged pieces of real estate in American political geography. 4 presidents carved permanently into granite, monuments to historical permanence. Standing beneath them to talk about Iran places that conflict into a specific category, not an ongoing crisis, not an unresolved negotiation, but a chapter already being filed into the permanent record of things America prevailed over. Granite, finished. And the timing compounds it. A nation's 250th birthday is a moment of maximum emotional priming, an audience already feeling pride, already primed to receive triumphant claims at full volume. Dropping the Iran line into that exact moment, in that exact place, in front of that exact crowd, is a calculation about how to cement a specific narrative into the national consciousness during the most emotionally resonant civic occasion in 50 years. Now parse each sentence individually, because they are doing very different things. We knocked the hell out of Iran. Past tense, completed action. Not we are, not we have been, done, finished. That grammatical choice places a military campaign that is still producing active, disputed, ongoing consequences, a ceasefire still being negotiated in Doha, an inspection standoff still unresolved, a fortified underground facility still under active construction, into the linguistic category of a resolved historical event. 1. Filed. Over. They're dying to settle. They want to settle so badly. This characterizes every diplomat and technical negotiator currently sitting in Doha working through the details of a memorandum neither side can fully agree on as a party, so thoroughly defeated it is desperate for relief. Not a sovereign actor pursuing its own interests through diplomacy. A defeated party begging for mercy. We gave them a week off for a funeral because we're nice. And here is where it becomes something far more extraordinary than a rally applause line. We gave them, not we observed, not we respected, active voice. America is the subject. Iran is the object. America made the decision about what Iran was permitted to do with its own grief, on what schedule, for how long. And by framing that as casual niceness, an extraordinary geopolitical claim gets delivered to the crowd as something almost offhand. Of course, we could have continued. We chose not to because we're generous. That is what those sentences actually said, stripped of the delivery that made them land as a joke. Now here is what made all of this even more extraordinary. Because what followed the Mount Rushmore speech was, if anything, sharper. The next day, speaking to Axios, the American president was asked about the funeral gathering nearly the entire surviving senior leadership of Iran in one place at one time. And he responded with a line that has since been reported by multiple outlets independently. They are all there. One shot, and we can take them all out. But we're not going to do that because then we would have nobody to negotiate with. Sit with that for a moment. During a diplomatic pause specifically designed to allow Iran to bury its former leader, the President of the United States publicly stated his country has the capability to eliminate the surviving senior leadership of Iran in a single strike, and then stated explicitly that the reason this is not happening is not restraint, not international law, not diplomatic norms, but the practical calculation that you cannot negotiate a deal with people you have just killed. The target is preserved, the restraint is instrumental, and the entire statement was delivered not as a threat, but as an almost casual observation about a live choice being made in real time, while the coffins were still in the courtyard. Iran's embassy in Armenia condemned the remark as a display of contempt for basic norms of civilization. Iranian state media called it grotesque. Hardline factions inside Tehran needed almost no time at all to begin using it. But here is the part most coverage gets wrong. The reaction inside Iran is not uniform. And the difference between how different factions are processing these statements tells you almost everything about where the Doha talks actually stand, and how likely they are to produce something real in the roughly 25 days remaining on the 60-day window that opened when the memorandum was signed on June 17th. Here is the Iranian internal political reality as it stands today, laid out completely. There is a pragmatic faction, the president, the foreign minister, the parliamentary moderates, who genuinely want to close this deal, unlock frozen assets, restore oil export revenue, and use whatever economic recovery follows to rebuild domestic legitimacy in a country where inflation is running near 70%, where food prices climb every week at the market, and where the regime crushed mass protests back in December of last year with lethal force that killed civilians and drove the underlying anger underground rather than eliminating it. There is a hardline faction, the Revolutionary Guard's senior commanders and the ideological conservatives inside the clerical establishment, who view the memorandum as national capitulation, who pushed through a parliamentary law banning inspections of any bombed nuclear site, and who treat every triumphalist American statement as fresh ammunition in their argument that settling with Washington is not pragmatism, it's surrender. And caught between those two factions, technically sovereign over both of them, sits a new supreme leader who has not been seen in public since the day his father was killed. Iranian security officials reportedly refused his own request to attend his father's funeral, fearing that his appearance could let Israel either kill him outright or trace him back to wherever he is currently hidden. Multiple independent reports, drawing on senior Iranian officials, describe him as having endured multiple operations on one leg, now awaiting a prosthetic limb, along with hand surgery and planned reconstructive procedures for severe facial burns sustained in the strike that killed his father. He's reported to have had very little direct contact with Iran's generals throughout the negotiations that are supposedly being conducted in his name. One Middle East analyst described his actual governing authority about as plainly as it can be described. He may hold the title of leader, but he answers to the Revolutionary Guard commanders whose backing keeps both him and the system around him standing. What that means in practical terms for the Doha process is this. The pragmatic negotiating faction is trying to close a deal it may not have the authority to actually deliver. The hardline faction that does have the practical power to block implementation has already demonstrated both the will and the legislative machinery to do exactly that. And the one figure who could theoretically force alignment between those two camps cannot physically appear at his own father's funeral. There's a further layer to this succession picture worth sitting with, because it clarifies exactly how power is currently distributed inside Tehran. Reporting drawing on multiple senior Iranian officials describes a small circle of Revolutionary Guard commanders and their allies effectively running the country's day-to-day decisions on security, war, and diplomacy, with the new supreme leader functioning less like a supreme religious authority in his father's mold and more like a figurehead who signs off on choices presented to him as largely settled. Messages reportedly travel to him by hand, sealed in envelopes, passed along a human chain of couriers rather than through any direct verifiable channel, and returned the same way. That is not simply an unusual security precaution. It's a governing structure in which the single most powerful title in the country currently functions through an information relay nobody outside it can independently confirm. At the exact moment the country is trying to convince the world, it speaks with one unified, credible voice at the negotiating table. Now put the Mount Rushmore speech back into that context and watch how the same handful of sentences produced two opposite effects inside the same political system at the same time. For the hardline faction, The speech is the most useful piece of evidence they have received since the memorandum was signed. We gave them a week off for a funeral because we're nice. Clip it, translate it, broadcast it. The American president is publicly describing the mourning of Iran's own supreme leader as a gesture of charity extended by a victorious power on a schedule that power itself decided. They will use this in every internal argument against the pragmatic track. Look what accommodation produces, they'll say. Not mutual agreement, not dignified resolution. A permission slip issued by a conqueror. The one-shot remark makes this worse still. Even during a week Washington has graciously designated for mourning, the president is publicly discussing the option of eliminating the assembled leadership and explaining, almost casually, that the only reason it isn't happening is tactical inconvenience. In factional politics, foreign humiliation is fuel, and this is a full tank of it. But, and this is the part that's genuinely counterintuitive and rarely said out loud, the same speech may also be quietly serving the pragmatic faction's interests in a way that careful diplomatic language never could. The pragmatic camp needs to convince the hardliners that the strategic balance has genuinely permanently shifted, that continued defiance has a ceiling, that the old assumption, that American resolve eventually breaks, that pressure campaigns eventually produce concessions, that the regime can simply outlast whichever administration is currently in office, no longer holds. A president standing at Mount Rushmore stating flatly that Iran is defeated and desperate to settle hands, the pragmatic faction the most powerful possible external validation of exactly that argument. It becomes much harder for hardliners to claim, in the private rooms where this actually gets decided, that Iran negotiates from strength when the American president is publicly characterizing it as beaten, and the watching world is largely accepting that framing without serious pushback. In some systems like this one, domestic cover for accommodation comes more effectively from the adversary's public triumphalism than from the adversary's diplomatic respect. If the pragmatists can turn to the hardliners and say, this is how the world now sees us, this is the position defiance operates from. Rejecting a deal means accepting this as permanent rather than trading it for economic recovery. That argument may land harder than any carefully calibrated statement about mutual respect ever could. Which of those two effects wins out inside Iran's factional politics over the next 25 days is genuinely unknowable from the outside. Both are real. Both are operating simultaneously. And the outcome depends on dynamics that nobody outside a very small circle in Tehran can currently observe with any confidence. It's worth naming plainly why outside observers keep running into that same wall of uncertainty. Because it isn't a failure of reporting. It's a structural feature of exactly the kind of opaque, factionalized system Iran currently is. There is no press conference where the actual balance of power gets announced. There is no vote total to read. The only signals available from outside are indirect. A law passed here, a diverted flight there, a satellite photograph of a tunnel entrance, the tone of a state broadcaster's script. Piecing together the real picture means treating every one of those signals as a data point in an argument still being fought entirely behind closed doors, which is exactly why the next 25 days matter so much. They are the period in which those indirect signals either start pointing consistently in one direction or keep contradicting each other the way they have for the past several months. Now the nuclear dimension specifically, because this is the piece of the story being almost completely buried under funeral coverage and Rushmore sound bites, and it's the piece that actually determines whether anything signed in Doha is worth the paper it's printed on. There's a facility roughly a mile south of the Natanz nuclear complex, buried deep inside the Zagros mountain range, known publicly as Pickaxe Mountain. Construction on it began years before this war started. International inspectors have never been allowed inside, and when the IAEA specifically pressed Iran on the site, the response from Iranian officials was reportedly blunt. It's none of the agency's business. Satellite imagery analyzed by the Institute for Science and International Security, using imagery it captured in late June, shows continued vehicle activity on the roads, leading to the site's western tunnel portals, along with ongoing work reinforcing the tunnel entrances themselves, indicating that construction inside the complex and hardening of its access points is actively continuing right now. The memorandum signed on June 17th requires Iran to maintain the status quo at nuclear-related sites, which by its own terms should prohibit exactly this kind of construction. Pickaxe Mountain is a nuclear-related facility. Construction there has not stopped. Meanwhile, at Iran's three principal damaged sites, Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, the same satellite analysis found essentially no reconstruction activity at all. Tunnel entrances at Fordo and Isfahan remain sealed with earth. Natanz's underground enrichment halls remain inaccessible, their access points unrepaired, their electrical and cooling infrastructure still destroyed. In other words, Iran appears to be leaving its bombed, internationally scrutinized facilities exactly as the strikes left them, while quietly continuing to build inside the one facility the world has never been allowed to see the inside of. Independent nuclear analysts tracking this exact site have been unusually direct about what that pattern likely means. Continued, Steady construction work at a facility this size, and this fortified, sitting untouched by the strikes that devastated every other site nearby, reads less like routine maintenance and more like a deliberate hedge, a fallback option being kept in reserve in case negotiations ultimately collapse, so that whatever happens at the table, Iran still has a nuclear facility in a late stage of construction sitting in reserve underground. Some analysts have gone further, suggesting the sealed intersections of the complex could plausibly be storing equipment or material relocated from the sites that were struck, though no independent verification currently confirms that either way, precisely because no independent inspector has ever been allowed inside to check. The IAEA itself has not conducted verification activity inside Iran since February 28th, the first day of the war, when Iran suspended cooperation entirely. The agency's own reporting states plainly that it has been unable to fulfill its safeguards obligations regarding Iran's affected nuclear material, and that it has lost what it calls continuity of knowledge over that stockpile. Iran is currently the only non-nuclear weapon state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty known to have produced and accumulated uranium enriched to 60%, a level with no legitimate civilian use, sitting well above the low single digits required for power generation and well below, but not unreachably below, the 90% threshold considered weapons grade. Nearly a year without independent verification of exactly how much of that material remains, and precisely where it currently sits, is not a paperwork gap. It's the exact kind of gap a state serious about proving compliance would want closed immediately, and the exact kind of gap a state hedging its options would want to keep open for as long as possible. Iran's parliament, for its part, has passed legislation specifically prohibiting inspection of any facility struck by American or Israeli forces, framing the ban as a matter of principle, insisting the IAEA must first establish clear rules for post-war inspection conditions before any monitoring resumes. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization has said publicly this week that inspections will not be permitted until such a framework exists. That framework does not currently exist. Building one takes time the 60-day window may not have, which means the inspection ban this deal is supposed to lift is currently being sustained by a procedural argument. The deal itself never actually resolved. This is the gap between the public narrative and the operational reality. Vice President J.D. Vance said last week that talks in Doha were going well, and that discussions specifically about the nuclear issue would start soon. Not have started, would start soon. The nuclear question, the entire reason this conflict began in the first place, is being described months into a negotiation supposedly built around it as a forthcoming agenda item rather than a resolved matter. And Turkey enters this picture in a way that adds yet another layer of complexity to an already crowded board. Turkey's president spoke publicly on the same day as the Mount Rushmore remarks, warning that the region must not be allowed to be drowned again in what he called the smell of gunpowder and blood, and stating plainly that Ankara was closely watching what it described as Israeli attempts to sabotage the agreement. That is not a minor diplomatic aside. Turkey is a NATO member, actively positioning itself as the region's indispensable mediator, publicly accusing another NATO member's closest regional ally of working to undermine the only diplomatic framework currently preventing renewed open conflict. That is an active operational complication for everyone trying to hold this deal together, not a footnote to it. Iran's foreign minister, separately, warned this week that any Israeli strike would draw an immediate and powerful response, framing Washington as having committed to restraining its ally. Israel's defense minister, for the second time in 4 months, publicly declared Iran's new supreme leader a marked target. And the American president, inside the same 48-hour window, said both that Iran is dying to settle and that its entire assembled leadership could be eliminated in a single strike if Washington simply chose to do it. Every one of those statements is now part of the public record. Every one of them is being read by a different audience for a different purpose. And the Doha talks, described by Qatari mediators as making positive progress before the funeral pause began, remain on hold until the ceremonies conclude on July 9th, with the actual nuclear question still filed under coming soon. Strip away all the official framing, and here is what's actually observable today. The memorandum signed on June 17th has roughly 25 days left in its 60-day window. The nuclear issue has not yet been substantively addressed inside that window. Pickaxe Mountain is under continued confirmed construction, while every previously bombed facility sits untouched. IAEA inspectors have had zero access to Iran's nuclear sites since the opening day of the war. Iran's own parliament has legally banned inspection of struck facilities, pending a precondition the agency has not met. Iran's supreme leader was reportedly denied permission by his own security services to attend his father's funeral. The hardline factions are already loading the Rushmore remarks into their internal case against the deal. The pragmatic factions are racing a clock they may not have the authority to actually stop. And the American president has publicly acknowledged the capability to eliminate the assembled Iranian leadership, explaining the only reason it isn't happening is that it would be tactically counterproductive right now. That is the complete picture. Not the official story, the observable one. And now the question the Mount Rushmore speech raised without answering, the one the next 25 days will settle one way or another. Is this administration negotiating for genuine, verifiable nuclear security, or is it negotiating for a deal it can describe as victory? Those are not the same objective. A deal that produces a public Iranian commitment on paper, combined with commercial shipping, resuming through the Strait of Hormuz, may be entirely sufficient to validate the Rushmore narrative domestically, regardless of whether it includes the kind of verifiable, inspectable, enforceable compliance that genuine nuclear nonproliferation actually requires. The triumphalist framing built over the last 48 hours needs a deal that looks like capitulation. It does not strictly require a deal that verifiably eliminates Iran's weapons capability. The inspection ban, the continued construction at Pickaxe Mountain, the roughly 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium that nobody outside Iran can currently account for. Every one of these represents a gap between the genuine security requirement and the narrative requirement. A gap a determined administration could simply choose to describe as a detail for follow-on talks. Consider, too, what this moment says about how conflicts like this one actually end. Because the assumption baked into most casual coverage is that this war effectively concluded the moment the missiles stopped and a memorandum got signed. That assumption doesn't hold up. Wars like this rarely end with a single signature. They end, if they end at all, through a long, grinding sequence of smaller confrontations, exactly like the one playing out right now. A law here, a diverted flight there, a warning over a shipping lane, a satellite photograph of a tunnel entrance, a purge inside a rival power's military command on the other side of the world, a soundbite from a granite mountainside. Each one looks like a footnote on its own. Taken together, they are the actual war, still being fought almost entirely through leverage, information control, and calculated ambiguity rather than airstrikes, and it is nowhere near finished. There's a wider audience receiving all of this that most coverage barely touches, because the analysis tends to stay locked on Tehran and Washington, while the rest of the world is quietly doing its own math. Beijing has enormous commercial exposure to Iranian energy and holds a long-term strategic cooperation agreement with Tehran worth hundreds of billions of dollars. When an American president stands at Mount Rushmore and calls Iran a defeated party desperate for settlement, Beijing is recalculating what that framing means for the value of its own partnership. And every American ally across the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, is quietly studying what this entire performance says about American operational confidence and resolve, because their own security arrangements depend on reading that signal correctly. Moscow, which has its own multi-billion-dollar nuclear reactor agreement with Tehran, is running a similar calculation because a weakened, economically desperate Iran is a fundamentally different partner than the defiant, nuclear-adjacent Iran-Russia originally signed that deal with. And European governments, still recovering from the energy price shocks this war caused, are working the phones during this funeral pause, trying to read whether American triumphalism signals genuine confidence that a deal will close, or a willingness to keep escalating if it doesn't. Two very different futures to prepare for. And there's one more audience worth naming plainly, because it barely gets discussed at all. The Iranian people themselves. The crowds filling Tehran's streets right now are real, the coffin is real, the chanting is real, but a country of roughly 90 million people contains enormous internal variation that a single funeral broadcast can't capture. Some genuinely grieve. Some perform grief because the social and political cost of visibly not grieving is simply too high. The economic conditions that produced last December's mass protests, inflation near 70%, food prices squeezing ordinary households every week, a widening gap between what the state promises and what families actually experience, have not improved since those protests were crushed with lethal force. They've gotten measurably worse. When the Mount Rushmore clip reaches ordinary Iranians through social media and workarounds to state censorship, it lands differently than it does in a crowd in South Dakota. For some, it's fuel that rallies them further behind the regime's narrative about foreign arrogance. For others, it's the first blunt, unfiltered external description of a war their own government has been calling a strategic victory. Both reactions exist simultaneously inside a population that has spent the last several months living through war, economic collapse, and a government crackdown on dissent, and the regime knows it, which is exactly why this funeral is being managed with such precision. Controlled mourning, revolutionary symbolism, chants that let people express genuine anger and demonstrate loyalty in the same breath. Which brings this to the observation almost nobody is stating plainly. The Mount Rushmore remarks, the dying to settle framing, the one-shot comment, all represent a specific bet about how triumphalist rhetoric affects the actual closing mechanics of a fragile deal. The bet is that public confidence accelerates the pragmatic faction's ability to close this thing faster than it empowers the hardliners' ability to block it. That is not an unreasonable bet, There is historical precedent for demonstrative strength producing negotiating partners who conclude that continued resistance simply costs too much. But the counterargument is equally strong. Language that publicly frames an adversary as defeated hands their hardliners the single most effective domestic argument for why any accommodation equals national humiliation, and it raises the political price of settlement for every pragmatist who now has to defend the deal to a public that just watched the other side call their country desperate for mercy. In a system where the supreme leader cannot force alignment between factions because he cannot even appear in public, that hardline argument carries real operational weight that more measured diplomatic language might have blunted. What everyone can observe concretely right now is this. The Doha talks stay paused until the funeral concludes on July 9th. Construction continues at Pickaxe Mountain. IAEA inspectors remain locked out. Iran's supreme leader remains unseen. The hardline faction has fresh humiliation fuel loaded into every internal argument against the deal. The pragmatic faction is racing a clock it may not have the authority to stop. And somewhere between a granite mountainside carved with the faces of 4 dead presidents and a red-flagged funeral procession still moving through the streets of Tehran, the actual resolution of this conflict is being written in rooms nobody outside them can currently see. The speech said Iran is dying to settle. The real question is whether dying to settle and able to deliver a settlement are the same thing. Watch Pickaxe Mountain, because the satellite imagery updates faster than any diplomat's press statement. Watch whether Iran's supreme leader appears at all before the funeral ends. Watch whether the IAEA gets a single meter of new access before the 60-day window runs out. And watch what actually emerges from Doha in specific, verifiable, observable terms. Not press releases, not applause lines, not sound bites carved metaphorically into granite, but the kind of concrete, inspectable fact that can be checked against a photograph from space. The speech is on the record. The coffins are still in the courtyard. And the 25 days that decide whether this was an accurate description of how a war ends, or premature victory lap delivered a little too soon, have only just begun. Because that ultimately is the gap this entire story lives inside: a granite mountainside announcing an ending, a tunnel complex in the Zagros Mountains quietly suggesting otherwise, a funeral procession chanting revenge. In the same week, a foreign leader joked about how generously it was permitted to happen. A supreme leader who exists mostly as a title, read aloud by state television anchors, governing a system that needs the world to believe he's fully in command while simultaneously keeping him hidden from the world entirely. None of these pieces resolve on their own. They only resolve when the 60-day clock runs out, when inspectors either walk through a tunnel portal or don't, when a leader either steps into public view or never does, and when the difference between a war that's over and a war that's merely paused finally becomes impossible to talk around.